All right, here we go. Theoretically, let's get into the control room. Already turned the monetization on, so that's taken care of. Wait, wait to load. There we go. Switch over to live chat. And I'm going to potentially stick with the paint map since I'm going to be changing things on it anyways, instead of Google Earth for just for this one, just for the data stream. Unless people suddenly start complaining and want me to go over to Google Earth, in which case I'll do that. Make sure these are synced up. Yes. All right. So for whoever is here already or whoever is watching the recording after the fact, it is June, which means the Statistical Review of World Energy has released, as it does each year. Not State of the Union, Statistical Review of World Energy. So if you want this, if you want all the data yourself, the PDF, you can just Google Statistical Review of World Energy, and it will be the first two things that come up. It used to be done by BP. However, it got released from their custody and transferred over to the International Energy Institute, whoever they are. So you just go up here, and it should have the PDF link right on the home page. And you can just click that and download it. I already downloaded it, so I don't need to download it now. But you can then get it yourself. And this one, and you scroll down through it, and it has detailed like commentary on stuff and some pie charts and whatnot. And then you get down into the tables, like here, just total energy consumption, everything put together. And then below that, it goes into carbon emissions and breaks them down by different types and sources. And below that, you then get into all the oil data and stuff like production, uh, and they have different presentations of it, like barrels versus million tons. I've, with the exception of I think Canada and India, I've never seen anyone referencing oil consumption or production in tons. It's always been in barrels. And then you breaks down to natural gas liquids and stuff, and then consumption. And basically, it's the same thing going down through each of the different types. You go then down into natural gas and all that. Now, all of these are not in the normal measurements that we always use. So some of them you do have to convert to get to the ones you're used to, or at least used to hearing me present stuff in. Like some of them, for some reason, are done in exajoules instead of like tons, or instead of in barrels or billion cubic feet per day. So you do have to do some conversions, except you guys don't, because I already did those. But if you want to do those yourself, you also can do those. So we are going to start off with coal. So the entire world as a whole had previously peaked. Let us see how big these numbers are. How big is this? That is nowhere near as big as I thought it would be. Can't go any larger than that apparently. So the entire world had previously peaked at about 8.8 billion tons of coal per year and started to decline. However, now, post COVID, it has climbed back up above that and has hit a new peak of 9.24 billion tons, GT for gigatons. 9.24 billion tons of coal. Now, how evenly do you think that's distributed? I'm gonna give you a second to formulate a guess, because it ain't evenly distributed. So the largest consumer of coal worldwide, again for all factors, for energy, which is the bulk of it for steel production, which makes up anywhere from like 1 or 2 up to as much as 10%, depending on the particular country, and then some small bit for chemistry and source of pure carbon. China is the biggest consumer. So out of those 9.24 billion tons, I'm just going to call them pure black. Out of those 9.24 billion tons, China consumes, are you ready? Are you ready? More than half of it, about 55%, as China's consumption this year exceeded, they're big enough we can go back to 72. They conceded or exceeded 5 gigatons, 5 billion tons out of that 9.24 is just consumed by China. So that's obviously more than half. Half of 9.2 is 4.6. So that is more than half. That's about 55%. And the next follow up country, we'll do dark red. The next largest consumer of coal used to be the US. However, because of India increasing and the US decreasing in coal consumption, it is now India. And India, yeah, white will still work best there. India, as of a couple years ago, exceeded 1 billion tons per year and is now up to just under 1.4 billion at 1.38 billion tons. So just China and India make out about 6.4 billion out of those 9.2 billion tons per year. And then the US comes in at number 3. We'll go switch down to brighter reds, coloring home up there. Oops. All right, that'll be enough. So the US, back at its peak in the mid 2000s, the US consumed about 1 billion tons of coal per year, and it peaked and plateaued there since the late 90s. However, uh, since the shale boom happened and we went natural gas crazy and started switching everything over to natural gas fired power plants, the US coal consumption has decreased over time over the last 20 years from about 1 billion down to just over 400 million tons. So or about 0.4 gigatons. Sorry, I was not able to mute while I sneezed. That was very unprofessional. But anyways, about 0.4 gigatons or 411 megatons of coal is what the US is down to. And our decline is now starting to level off because we do make a lot of steel. And also, we started to realize that getting rid of a big chunk of or a remaining chunk apart from nuclear of your baseload power generation capacity might not actually be the brightest idea in the world. So between those three, China, India, and the US, that is, they comprise 6.8 out of those 9.2 billion tons. So the entire rest of the world is only 2.2 billion. And how does that further break down? I'm not doing every country. Don't worry. We're not going to be here forever. I'm just doing the largest consumers. So I likely won't go past number 20 on any particular list. Is anybody even here? No. Anybody even here? No. 2. All right. I'm going to do this anyways, assuming there might maybe be people who are watching afterwards. So Japan is currently the number 4 consumer of coal, and they are at, or rather, they're down to, after peaking in the lower 200s, they were declining and until the Fukushima incident, and they upped their coal use to compensate for shutting down their nuclear plants. However, unlike Germany, they realized that uh, it might be better to just install the safety features that they kind of dodged out on and keep using the nuclear power rather than go without it and switch and have to be relying on coal and gas imports, the majority of gas of which they were actually getting from Russia for a while. So, and also, uh, since the Fukushima stuff was not what it was made out to be, and there's actually kind of straight up people living there again now, not like right next to the reactor, obviously, but it's not it's not like this 20-kilometer wide exclusion zone or anything. Japan has declined from re-peaking in the early 2010s in the lower 200s in million tons per year down to actually, oops, sorry, I misordered these because I misordered these. So I'm going to finish Japan and then we'll go to the actual number 4 and 5. Japan is actually technically number 6. But, anyways, they're now down to about 180 in million tons per year and are gradually declining in coal use as they are reactivating their nuclear plants. They've reactivated about a third of them. They're back up to being 10% nuclear power versus their power grid used to be comprised of about 30% nuclear. The actual, you make sure have everybody down packed correctly. Yes, the actual number 4 is in reality Indonesia. And apologies to any non-existent Indonesian viewers. I'm not going to color every single island, but I'll do a bunch of them. And also apologies to you guys for my fictional future in that novel I'm writing where Krakatoa erupts again. So you guys kind of get screwed over, but somebody has to be. Now, Indonesia is continuing their rapid economic rise and also, thusly, their power demand rise, just like India next door. And they, over the last 10 years, have gone from 90 million tons per year in coal consumption all the way up to now 330 million tons per year of coal consumption just over the last decade. So the top the top 4 plus Japan then in total is already 7.3 out of that 9.2 billion tons per year. So that's only 1.9 billion tons per year spread across the entire rest of the world outside of them. And that further breaks down into the number 5 consumer, which is Russia, who has gradually increased were we doing black? Yeah, we're doing black for the brighter red. Over the last 10 years or so, most of which was in the 2010s while their economy was still increasing before COVID and then before the Ukraine invasion and subsequent blowback from that. But during those years leading up to the start of the 2020s, Russia's coal consumption did increase in that short time span of like 5 or 6 years from 200 million tons per year up to 260 million tons per year. I didn't get to put the MT, but you guys can just suffer and remember it anyways. Now let me check. Let me just make sure that the rest of these will be in the correct order. I don't have to keep an eye on and or reorder things. All right, everything looks to be in proper alignment. So, potentially a surprise to some, but not entirely. The next largest consumer after Japan would be next. So, number 7 is South Africa, who at their height consumed in the lower 200 million tons per year, whereas Japan is because they have a higher population at a much higher economic level and much larger industrial output. So they had they have higher electricity demand, and they also make a lot of steel. But still, only about a third of their power generation at their height was coal fired. South Africa is close to entirely coal fired power generation. And thus, even though they have a smaller population at a lower economic level, that still put them up at higher numbers. But they have declined just like Japan, but for different reasons. In their case, it's because they have been gradually falling apart. The whole country, in basically every way. Most of you are probably aware of this. So now they're down to 100. Actually, no, then Japan would be number 7. I messed that up again. And South Africa would actually be number 6. They're down to 190 million tons per year. And so throwing them onto Russia, you can rough out another 400 or so. So that brings you up to 7.7 billion out of those 9.2 billion tons, which leaves you with only 1.5 billion spread across the entire rest of the world. So who's up next? It looks like Germany, Deutschland. Need to check the refigured numbers. No one else is competing. All right. Indeed, it is Deutschland. Now, lower hundreds, so we'll switch over to orange. So, Germany, you guys could have been much lower than this. I know you guys hate coal and everything, really, but you could have been a lot lower than this if you didn't deactivate and deconstruct all of your nuclear plants like a negative 50 IQ moron. But no, here you are, burning way much more than you have to. Great work. Fantastic intellectualism going on there. So Germany, although down from its height, its peak back in the 90s of about 400 million tons per year, they've gone all the way down to 130. And if they had not deactivated the nuclear plants and had to compensate that power generation with coal, they would actually be under 100 and probably all the way down at only around 50 million tons per year. But they are still over. Okay, looks like we can go a bit bigger than that. 26? 26 will fit. Actually, 28 might even fit. There we go. So Germany is still over 100 at 130 million tons per year in terms of their coal consumption. And as long as there's no other mishaps here, the next largest consumer is back over in Asia, South Korea. We're definitely going to have to put their number next to them in the C. So South Korea has been declining in their coal use over time. They peaked at a highest level of 166, and they have declined over the last decade or 15 years or so down to about 124 million tons per year and are still gradually on their way downwards. And then there's only 2 others who are above 100 million tons per year. The first of which is Vietnam, who, as of this year, has now gone over 100 million tons after just hitting 100 million last year. Over the last 10 years, which the data tables in each statistical review PDF will go back about 10 years. Over the last 10 years, Vietnam's coal consumption has gone from 38 all the way up to now 109 million tons per year. And the one other country currently above 100 is Australia, who peaked higher back in the mid 2000s, around the same time as the US. Australia peaked at around 150 or so, up at 154, and has since declined down by exactly 50, down to 104 million tons per year. And then there's no one else who's over 100 tons, but we do have two who are close to 100 million tons. One of those being, I could still classify that as orange. One of those being Germany's neighbor Polska. Polska peaked in the 80s, up around 300 million tons per year, but has since declined pretty thoroughly down to just under 100. And they are currently at, oops, have to actually switch to a text color. They are currently at, oh, wait, we could fit even larger in there. 36 fit in there? It can. They are currently at 95 million tons per year of coal consumption. And Kazakhstan is also in the 90s, currently at 91 million tons per year of coal consumption. And they have remained relatively the same over the last decade or so in terms of their coal consumption. A lot of their new power generation capacity that they've added over the last decade has primarily been gas and hydropower, and now a little bit of wind. Down here in the southeastern corner of the country, where there's a lot of like air waterfalls sweeping down from the mountainous border with China. So their coal consumption has remained relatively steady for the last decade or so. And oh, wait, I forgot Turkey. Sorry, Turkey, I forgot you. Turkey is also in the 90s. They just reached it. They're climbing in coal use over time, but they are climbing slowly. They, over the last 10 years, have gone from 79 up to now 92 million tons per year in terms of coal consumption. Anybody actually out there? uh, well, thank you. I mean, I would hardly call typing in numbers on MS Paint excellent, but there are other people who cover energy data. I've seen them a few times, although I haven't seen them recently. I think the last time I came across one of them was way back in 2022 or something. And then after that, uh, everybody else falls off pretty quickly. Let's see, Taiwan, Malaysia, Philippines. Yeah, it looks like Taiwan is the next one down, and they are decreasing in coal use as well. They're down to 61 million tons per year, declining from 72 10 years ago. As they are switching, they're starting to gain a decent amount of wind power because it is really windy around the island. And also, they would be lower in coal use if it were not for the fact that they are deactivating their nuclear power plants, which they have done secretly, quietly, not announcing it to the world to virtue signal like Germany did. But they're doing it for a very different reason. Whereas Germany did it because they're stupid, Taiwan is doing it because it, they kind of have to, since, the whole invasion from China is coming up relatively soon. So they want those offline when that happens, just in case they get hit, whether intentionally or accidentally. And then their southern neighbor is the next largest consumer right after them, the Philippines, who has just this year exceeded 51 million tons per year and kick back up to, we'll do 48. Over the last 10 years, they've climbed from 23 all the way past double that up to 51 million tons per year. They are relying on coal a fair bit for their power generation, but just like Indonesia, they're one of the few countries that is smart enough to actually go full in with geothermal as well. And finally, I'm going to pretend it's because of me. I'm going to pretend that Congress and the U.S. Department of Energy is secretly watching my videos or something. We, back in the U.S., have finally just out of the blue, out of nowhere, announced multiple new deep geothermal projects. But that's going to take a little while to come about. And then, was there nobody else that close? It doesn't look like it. So the next closest one after them is Malaysia. Like I said, after the big ones, it kind of falls down really fast. Malaysia has climbed from 24 up to 40 million tons of coal per year for their consumption levels over the last decade or so. And then after that, the list goes further and further downward. There are a number of cases. We'll actually be going to the lower end before moving on to the next subject. So there are a couple of cases of complete removal of usage or almost removal. The UK, for example, has declined from a peak in the 80s or 90s of about 140 million tons per year down to only last year they used a grand total of 6, and that was split between still having coal-fired power generation during the early half of the year and the tiny bit of steel making they still do. However, they kind of got rid of a lot of their industry. They deindustrialized themselves, just like Germany is now doing, and import a lot of the stuff that they otherwise used to manufacture because, they're European and Europeans view industry and manufacturing as evil, along with oil and mining. And basically, human existence is viewed as evil at this point. So, if they still actually made domestically as much steel as they use, they would actually stay in the upper ones between like 5 and 10 million tons per year. But because they barely make any and they've completely stopped all coal fired power generation, next year the number is probably going to come in at like 1 or 2 million tons, maybe at the most. And were there any other interesting cases? Uh, Not too many. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next one. What are we going to do next? Let me check these. All right, we'll do total electricity consumption. So I'm going to shut this down and then open another one. All right, electricity consumption. So Electricity demand varies over time, given different times of the day, different months of the year. All kinds of different things affect how much electricity is being used at any particular point. So it can fluctuate as much as like 60 to 80% between a low point and a high point. But the median, the rough average amount, if you were to clock the world's grid in at any given time, the median average demand load on the grid is continuing to go up, and last year climbed by 4%, actually, going from 3.3 up to now 3.42 terawatts of average demand load on the grid, or what the dial would read if you measured the entire global electricity grid at once. And again, that's not the constant number like 24/7 that differentiates between different times. Like depending on what regions of the world are in daytime currently, which means everybody's awake and every business place is open, so everything's on, versus what regions are in nighttime, and whether it's the northern or southern hemisphere that's in summer, because the northern hemisphere is where most of the population lives. So electricity demand is a lot higher during the northern hemisphere summer versus the southern hemisphere summer. But it's now up to 3.42 terawatts of average electricity demand. And who's the largest electricity consumer? No time to give you a guess. It's China. Zhongguo, because of course it is. They are now, on average, at any given moment, over 1 terawatt of electricity demand themselves, coming in to now average 1.15, or basically, and a solid third of the entire world's electricity demand is just China itself. The US is actually second in total electricity use. So color us in with the dark red there. We come in gradually climbing, very slowly. Uh, we hit we hit our gradual setting once we reached the late 90s. That was when you could basically affirm that the U.S. had completed its economic rise up to complete modern standards of what was modern living standards at the time. So we got around the mid 400s and then gradually, very gradually, have climbed since then, as our population has still continued increasing. Where let's see, late 90s, we were at like 270 million, I think. Yeah, 'cause I think in 2000, for that census, we were at 283, and then 2010 we hit 309. 2020 we hit 2020 was 2020 was like 331, and now we're at 342 million, as our population growth is slowing because now the our larger baby boomer age brackets are starting to hit the end of their life expectancy. So the imbalance between deaths and births is starting to even out. However, we're still not going to be going in Europe or Japan's direction for quite a fair while. But the U.S. has climbed over the last 30 years, gradually from around 450 up to now roughly 520 gigawatts of electricity consumption, usually on average at any given time. It varies. For example, we can go check right now. We go over here. The US is one of the few countries that has a live electricity grid tracker. Current demand load is, or at least was as of 6 p.m. today, which was about an hour and a half ago, 657 gigawatts. And the highest point we ever hit was 743. We came pretty close a few days ago, 731. That was pretty close on a really, really hot day. But anyways, back to it. So on average, US is up to about 520 and still increasing, but again, really slowly at a gradual crawl upwards. It's primarily at this point only being driven by the fact that our population is still increasing. And then the third largest consumer is obviously India, who is now up to over 200 gigawatts of average demand load at any given time. They're actually up to now an average of 232. And they're increasing at about 10% per year still. That pace won't continue forever, but that is the pace they're at. And they do have a very wide range. Like, for example, last year, they fluctuated from as high as 260 to as low as like 170 or 160 something, depending on whether they're in the hot or the colder portion of the year. And obviously, at night during the colder portion of the year, they'll go really low towards like 160. But their average is now around 232. And the fourth largest consumer, dropping a fair bit further down yet again, is Russia, with Russia coming in at about 138 gigawatts on average. And they have gradually climbed up there during the last decade, most of which, again, was in the 2010s before multiple factors, first COVID and then their whole Ukraine adventure stalled their economic stuff. During the time period where they were still going up like that, they increased a bit from 121 up to 138, and now they're kind of stopping off here. And then the final member who is just barely still in triple digits is Japan. However, they're about to not be anymore. So they peaked at 121 during the 90s and 2000s. And since then, because of population decrease and just their population aging, as the older a population gets, the less activities they do, and thus the less total economic activity there is. Their electricity demand has gone down from 121 at its height down over the last 20 or 25 years to about a flat 100 gigawatts or so of average demand load. And then after them, drop ourselves down into the orange category. Germany comes in orange once again. I believe we could fit 28 or 36 in there. Well, it's only a double digit number. So Germany, Deutschland, used to consume closer to 100 gigawatts consistently as their average demand load. Again, fluctuates throughout the day and throughout different times of the year. But just like the UK, Germany has been in the process of rapidly deindustrializing itself, getting rid of all those, mean, evil, dirty things like manufacturing meaningful things for the world and producing, chemicals that are kind of vital to our existence as a modern civilization. They've declined rapidly down to averaging only 75 gigawatts of power demand at any given time. And next up, we go across here over to Canada. I'm not going to color in every single island, but I'll give you guys enough, power, friendship, and all to not be too blank. Yeah, get those ones, that one, and that one. All right, you guys can live with that. And Vancouver Island, I'll get that one too. Canada is gradually increasing, just like us in the U.S. for the same reason they hit their increasing plateau around the same time as us, because we were both basically on the same path, and they have just like us because their population is still slowly increasing. Their electricity demand is still going up, just very gradually. Over the last 10 years, since the mid 2010s up until now, they've increased from 65 up to averaging now around 70 gigawatts of electricity demand load across their grid at any given moment. While down in South America, you have Brazil, and Brazil has climbed over the last 10 years or so from 55 up to now averaging about 65 gigawatts across their grid at any given moment. And oh, wait, oops, forgot somebody. Sorry, forgot South Korea over here. Let's see, is that enough? No, we're gonna have to downsize. Go down to 36. That should work. South Korea is leveling off. They started leveling off in the mid to upper 60s and are now kind of reaching their plateau around 70, with their average last year being about 71 gigawatts of demand load on their grid at any given moment. And they're, like I said, they're plateauing here since their population is now decreasing and their population is going to start aging very rapidly, just like Japan's did. Uh, they're a bit they're a bit staggered behind, as in their big like bulk bulge is lower than lower than where Japan's was. So their total aging thing has been a bit behind Japan, whereas Japan started that earlier. Where is South Korea? Oh, there it is. So yeah, theirs is down here. They're just starting to reach 65 plus for their big baby boom bulge here. Whereas Japan's was basically right after the war. So Japan started hitting like senior age 20 years ago. So Japan's one is like already up in the 80s for where these big, huge outlier bulges are. So that's the reason why South Korea has stayed up for the time being, up until now at least, while Japan started going downwards way earlier. And then next up, we have France. France has gradually declined over the last 10 years or so from 65 down to 60 gigawatts for their average demand load. And that is despite their population increasing, but increasing very, very gradually. Like over the last 10 years, it went from, I think, 66 up to 68 or 65 up to 68 million. But Europe has been a lot more heavy-handed on the energy efficiency transition and implementation of various stuff like that. Although, with how heavy-handed Europe wants to go for the electric vehicle stuff, that's going to slow down their electricity demand decline in the coming years. Who is next? Looks like, oh, and I say this sarcastically. Okay, so I don't mean this before anybody thinks I do. Everybody's favorite Middle Eastern country, Saudi Arabia, is now up over 50. And they, over the last 10 years, have gone from 37 up to now averaging 52 gigawatts of electricity demand at any given moment. And their current breakdown is about a third of their power generation is from oil fired power plants, literally just burning crude oil itself. About 60% or a bit above 60% is natural gas fired, and then a tiny percentage is from some solar projects. Next, just below them, or not just below them, but a decent bit below them is it Mexico, Turkey, or Indonesia? It's Indonesia. All right, go down to yellow shading now. And I'll color in a bit, but for sake of time, I'm not going to do everything. All right, you guys can live with that. Indonesia, economically rising fast. Over the last 10 years or so, their electricity demand levels have almost doubled. They've gone from 26 up to now 43 gigawatts of electricity demands on their grid at any given moment. And next up behind them is Mexico, just to the south of us, whose electricity demand has climbed over the last 10 years from 35 up to averaging 41 gigawatts across their grid at any given moment. And the one other country in the 40s is now Turkey, or Turkey, who has climbed over the last 10 years from 29 up by about 30% or 35% technically to averaging over the last year or so about a flat 40 gigawatts across their grid at any given moment. And I forgot I was going to do the regional comparisons, so I'll throw those in now. The entirety of Europe itself, excluding Belarus and Russia, and excluding Turkey, apparently I have to specify that. Uh, some statistics and stuff will include Turkey in with Europe, which when I mentioned that both European and Turkish people got angry, so apparently neither one wants that inclusion. So excluding Turkey, Russia, and Belarus, uh, everything else, the entirety of continental Europe has a total regional demand load on average of just over 404 gigawatts. They've declined over the last 10 years or so from 421 down to 404. And so that is like US to EU comparison, 520 gigawatts of demand across 342 million people. Europe is 404 gigawatts of average demand across about 570 million people. But the economic output is also higher over on this end, but still our average like individual consumer level consumption is also higher. And we will do some specific countries in Africa, but for Africa as a whole, the entire continent, population of 1.1 billion at this point, has grown from 88 10 years ago up to now 110 gigawatts of total power consumption across the entire continent of 1 billion plus. And most of their power consumption is predominantly in like three specific countries that comprise like 80% of it, those being Egypt, South Africa, and Algeria. We'll get into that in a moment. But continuing down on country scales, the next two tied for their place, although Iran's has recently dropped precipitously since the conflict with Israel started. They're, if I'm going to assume that they're electricity demand has dropped over the last few weeks in a similar manner to what their oil demand dropped by. That is about half or a bit more, then they are likely nowhere near this number. But still, before everything started, their electricity demand was around 35 gigawatts of demand load on the grid at any given time on average. Now it's probably down below 20 because of everything that started recently. Vietnam, economically rising very fast, as everybody knows, has more than doubled over the last 10 years from an average demand load of only 16 up to now also having an average demand load of 35 gigawatts on their grid at any given time. And as long as this order is correct, the next one in line is Taiwan, who is relatively stable. They basically plateaued in their consumption level. Oops, need to switch to black for the text. They're in the low 30s and they plateaued out here. So 33 is their current average. And where are we going next? Who's next? I did not properly label this. There it is. Spain. España is also over 40, or sorry, over 30, just barely. Spain has plateaued out as well, along with many other European nations. They average 32 gigawatts across their grid at any given moment. They're pretty consistent with that. Or sorry, no, 33. Sorry, it's Italy that's 32. Spain is 33. And Italy is 32 and plateaued similar. I'm not going to go through the awkward process of trying to actually fit a number in there. And the UK, as I said, has rapidly deindustrialized itself as it's in the process of uh, self destruction. I guess they're just done with life, societally done with life, I guess. They've declined from 45 all the way down to only 31 gigawatts of average demand load on their grid, as they've gotten rid of a lot of their industry and manufacturing. Then we drop under 30, with the next one coming up being Australia, who is similar to us, the US and Canada, very gradually climbing. They hit their plateau climb session after fully rising by the 80s or 90s, like we did as well. And their upwards trend is predominantly driven by the fact that they still have an increasing population, although very gradually, very slowly. So over the last 10 years, they have increased from 26 up to about 28 gigawatts of average demand load on their grid. Meanwhile, we swing over here. South Africa has gone down, not because the demand would not be there, but because the country's power grid is so far gone and just crushed that it can't even provide as much electricity as would otherwise be used if the South African economy and industry could function at its full potential, but it can't. So after reaching the lower 30s, South Africa's average electricity demand load, primarily again because this is all the power grid can provide, has declined to around 25, whereas I think the highest it reached was like 32 or 33 before they started their national death spiral 15 years ago. So they're ongoing with that whole national death spiral process at this very moment. Let me check, make sure I didn't skip over anybody who is higher. I put an abbreviation in here that do not, I do not know what it means. Oh no, I do know what it means. Okay. But anyways, that abbreviation aside, Thailand, I forgot, is actually higher. They are at 28 gigawatts of average demand load, and they have climbed from 21 up to 28 over the last 10 years. Although their demand increase is going to be slowing down soon. And then over here in Egypt, like I said, or we already have South Africa as 25 out of that, out of Africa. Africa is 110 total. Egypt is also at 25 now. Over the last 10 years, they've climbed from 17 up to averaging about 25 gigawatts of demand load on their grid, or maybe closer to 24. We'll put it at 24 for safety. So, like I said, most of Africa's electricity demand is concentrated in like a few countries. It's not evenly spread. And who else is in the 20s usually, consistently, at least in terms of gigawatts? On this page, we have Malaysia. Was there anybody else back here? UAE just hit 20 in demand load. So the only other one over 20 at the moment is Malaysia, who has, over the last 10 years, gone from, flip this over again, 16 up to averaging 22 gigawatts of demand load across their grid at any given moment. Meanwhile, the UAE, I can't fit the number in there without it being very small, but the UAE has reached about 20 gigawatts of average demand load and is starting to level off, starting to plateau here. So it's probably not going to keep going up by all that much past the lower 20s, since that's about where you'd land with that small population at a really high living standard. And then I'm not going to do everybody else going down through like the teens and the smaller numbers, but I will arbitrarily hit a few other countries just for the sake of it. Polska, one of my favorites, is averaging about 18 gigawatts on their grid, and they've been steady around there. They've been consistently averaging 18 for the last 10 years or so. Algeria, another arbitrary favorite for no particular reason. Algeria has climbed as they've resumed economically rising. They had a big stall from their civil war in the 90s and from the aftershocks of their civil war, which continued, not the war, just the after effects of it that continued through the 2000s. As they've resumed economically rising and rather quickly, they've climbed in domestic electricity demand from 7.3 up to now 11 and, oops, have to set that to black, go down to 48, up to 11.5 gigawatts of average demand on their grid. And anybody else I want to include? Not from this page. What about on this page over here? With regards to Nigeria, Nigeria over the last 10 years has steadily climbed up by about 30% from averaging 3 to now averaging just over 4 gigawatts of demand on their grid, uh, out of a country of 230 million people. Maybe we'll fill in some of the other North African ones. Libya has remained pretty consistent. The civil war starting, stopping, and then restarting again constantly over the last decade has kept them from really going anywhere. So they've stayed pretty consistent at 3.5 gigawatts of demand on average. Oops, not black. Tunisia has dropped down to 36. Tunisia has climbed from 1.7 up to a bit under 2.2 on average, from a combination of small population and economic stall. And Morocco, or its real name, Maroc, has climbed from. Are they on the other page? Yes, they are. No, they're not. Yes, they are. They've climbed from 3.3 10 years ago up to a flat, solid 5 gigawatts of average demand load today. And that will throw in Iraq too. Iraq has climbed rapidly, more than doubling its demand over the last 10 years from 7 up to averaging 19 gigawatts across its grid at any given moment. Jordan, another one of my arbitrary favorites, and one of the few stable places in the region, has a similar demand load to Tunisia and also has a similar population to Tunisia. However, Jordan is thankfully economically starting to rise more quickly than Tunisia, while Tunisia has stalled. Jordan is actually having a more beneficial time for the moment, though. Jordan has climbed from 1.8 up to 2.3 gigawatts of average demand load. Can't really squeeze that in there all that well. Anybody else that I wanted to throw in here? All right, throw in a couple more, then we're moving on to natural gas consumption and production. Uh, so my favorite African countries, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Kenya. So Ghana over the last 10 years or so, as they have been decently economically rising pretty quick, has doubled in demand or close to doubled from 1.2 or 1.25 up to about 2.2 gigawatts of average demand. And then Cote d'Ivoire has climbed from about half a gigawatt or 500 megawatts up to a full flat 1 gigawatt of average demand. And then Kenya, over the last 10 years, has climbed from basically a flat 1 up to now basically just under 2 gigawatts of average demand load. And then, since for some reason I have a lot of Somali viewers and commenters, I don't know how that came about. Somalia is still, in terms of its electricity demand, on average, is still down in only megawatts. Uh, Somalia has climbed over the last 10 years, most of which has been in just the last 2 or 3 since essentially the defeat of Al Shabaab, since the Somali Defense Forces effectively, or Somali, I think Somalia calls it Somali Security Force. I'm not sure. Since they effectively retook the country from the various insurgent groups, most of that electricity demand growth and economic growth that was kind of what drove it has occurred just within the last few years. Uh, but it's still down in megawatts at 35 megawatts 10 years ago, up to now 45 megawatts currently, which in gigawatts would be 0.045. And that's everyone I'm going to do for the electricity listings. It's going to exit out of there. Hello, the future. I was unaware timelines are sentient. Was there anything else in here? No. Back down here, open this up again. So let me find them first. Let me find where I put them. That's nuclear, that's coal, that's CO2. There's gas. Okay. Natural gas Consumption levels, consumption and production. So now it's actually not what it's been for the past few times. Regarding natural gas, the largest consumer is actually the US, who has a consumption level of roughly, on average, 90 billion cubic feet per day. And that is C for consumption, 90 billion cubic feet per day versus in the upper teens. So on average, 115 billion cubic feet per day plus for domestic production or output from US natural gas fields. So about between 5 and 10, depending on what time of the year, billion cubic feet per day of that excess we're shipping down to Mexico through pipelines. And the other 15 plus or so we're now sending out on LNG tankers. The second largest consumer and second largest producer is Russia, who has a domestic consumption level of around 47 billion cubic feet per day and a domestic production level of around roughly between 60 and 65. So we'll do a dash split there. They used to be in the 70s, even close to 80 before invading Ukraine. But in the departure of most of their customer base after that, they've had to reduce their consumption, or sorry, their production and thus their profit from such, because almost no one is really buying from them anymore except China and India and Turkey. And then the next largest consumer and producer is China, Zhongguo, who actually would be the fourth largest producer if Iran were producing at their capability levels, but they're not. That's been a subject we've mentioned a number of times in recent videos. China is now up to a demand level of 42 billion cubic feet per day and a production level of about 24 billion cubic feet per day. So they are desperately trying to chase their consumption levels with their increasing production, but they're not going to be able to catch themselves. And then coming up next in both angles is Iran. We're going to have to shrink down to fit both, probably do 36. So Iran has leveled off at around 24 billion cubic feet per day of domestic consumption, and several billion cubic feet of that is just being pumped back down into their oil fields to keep them pressurized enough so they can maintain their exports. And their domestic production levels have declined because of inability to get oil and gas equipment from Russia, since Russia has been cut off from the outside world except for smuggling from China. And also just the Iranian government not really putting that much focus into it. So they could otherwise be up between 27 and 30, but instead they're down between 21 and 24 at any given moment now in terms of their production levels, which is why you've seen it pop up in the news off and on that they'll go for a few weeks here and there where they have to uh, shut everything down, like businesses and industries and stuff, to conserve on power demand since they're almost entirely powered by natural gas-fired power generation. All right, and then the after Iran, the order this matchup ends where the first four places are the only ones where the consumption and production levels of the ranking member are basically the same. After that, it starts veering off in different directions, becoming imbalanced, or sorry, where their ranking is in consumption and production is basically the same. That stops after number four. We're going down the list in order of consumption. So the next largest consumer of natural gas is Saudi Arabia, who has a current demand level of 12 billion cubic feet per day. That is gradually increasing as they continue to switch more of their power generation over to natural gas-fired power plants. And their production level is also just about 12 billion cubic feet per day because they've never really been interested in exporting natural gas for some reason. They just flare a lot of their excess gas, but their numbers match, but their rank does not. They're lower on the producer ranking than they are on the consumer ranking. But again, we're going down the list in order of consumer size. So Saudi Arabia is number five in consumers with a consumption level of 12 billion cubic feet per day, along with a production level of 12 billion cubic feet per day. The next largest consumer was Japan for a number of years post Fukushima, but as they've reactivated their nuclear power plants, their gas consumption has dropped along with their coal consumption. So now the next largest consumer is once again Canada, who has reached a consumption level in present day of about 12.5 billion cubic feet per day. So 12.5 C for consumption, over a production level on average of roughly 20 billion cubic feet per day. So Canada also exports a decent bit of natural gas. All right. Let me check the list real quick. Just make sure I didn't put anybody out of place. I did not. Okay, everybody is in their correct place. The next largest consumer is now Mexico. Japan is right below them. Mexico has reached a consumption level of 10 billion cubic feet per day over a production level of only about 3 billion cubic feet per day. Actually, sorry, no, the UK is down to 3. Mexico is still at 4. 4 billion cubic feet per day of production versus 10 billion cubic feet per day of consumption. And then it's Japan who's up next as we descend into, oops, not the ocean, just Japan. We descend into yellow as we're going down to single digits. Japan hits a 12 or 12.5 billion cubic feet per day consumption level during, again, the first few years post Fukushima. But as they've been reactivating their nuclear plants, they've gone down from over 12 to now only having a consumption level of about 9 billion cubic feet per day and having a production level of 0 because they don't really have oil and gas fields. Their topography and geology don't match for it, with the exception of maybe in that shared area of the southern portion of the Japan Sea that they share with Korea. There might be some stuff there, but no one's really positive. So we'll have to find out eventually. The next largest consumer is Germany, whose consumption levels, again, would be lower if they had not deactivated all their nuclear power plants. No, we're going to have to go smaller than that to fit both in here, I think. So Germany is currently at a consumption level of about, oops, I did not mean to hit the Alt button. Germany's at a consumption level of about 8 billion cubic feet per day. Over a production level, they do have some. They do have some natural gas output. I think they're around 400 million with an M cubic feet per day, or about 0.4 billion cubic feet per day. So they did not have all that much oil and gas to begin with. So they, at one point, at their highest back in the 70s, they were at 2 billion cubic feet per day of production. But now they've almost depleted everything, so they're all the way down to 0.4. And do another double check to make sure I don't have anybody out of place. I do not. Okay. So next is the UAE. And again, I'm not going to try to fit a number in there, so we're going to let's do this. We'll draw a line out here down to the middle of the water, and we'll put the number there. All right, so the UAE has reached a consumption level of about 7 billion cubic feet per day. And this is where they seem to be leveling off. They're plateauing, not going any higher, since their all their new additional electricity generation is coming from their nuclear plant that they started up, and their natural gas production levels are still only at about 6 billion cubic feet per year. They do import 1 billion cubic feet, or sorry, per day. They do import 1 billion cubic feet per day from Qatar through a undersea pipeline. However, they are working on additional gas capture from their oil fields to be able to meet their current domestic demand. Then over in India, their their demand levels for natural gas, their consumption levels have reached about 7 billion cubic feet per day, and they are increasing at decent speed. So they're at 7 for consumption. Meanwhile, their production is only about 3 billion cubic feet per day. Most of what they have in terms of oil and gas resources is predominantly oil, uh, versus, like, say, Malaysia, who most of what they have around their offshore is predominantly gas. The same thing with Australia. And then going under 7 down into 6 or so. There's a few countries that have a average demand level of 6. So similar to Japan with a consumption or a production level of 0, South Korea has a demand level of about 6. Oops, switch text color. South Korea has a demand level or consumption level of about 6 billion cubic feet per day. And they have gradually increased to that from 5 billion cubic feet per day about a decade ago. Next up, with a consumption level of 6 per day, is the UK. The UK, I'm probably gonna have to shrink to fit them in the North Sea here. The UK has a demand level of 6. They've declined from 8 a while back, as their electricity demand has gone down as a result of them deindustrializing themselves. So they're at about 6 billion cubic feet per day for their consumption levels, over 3 billion cubic feet per day for their production levels. At the height of their production decades ago, they were at around 10 billion cubic feet per day, but now they're all the way down to 3. And even though their consumption has dropped down to 6, they still have to rely on imports, predominantly from Norway, so not too much of an issue. And then Egypt has also reached 6 billion cubic feet per day. Will 36 fit in here? Probably. So Egypt has reached 6 billion cubic feet per day, and their production levels, their natural gas output from their fields, should be 6. It should be able to meet it, but they're starting to have Nigeria issues, with internal government corruption and They're government officials sort of reallocating funds, and by reallocating, they mean into their own bank accounts instead of reinvesting the money into maintenance of oil and gas infrastructure. So their oil and gas, or sorry, their natural gas production has dropped down to now only about 4 billion cubic feet per day. So now they're on deficits and are predominantly importing gas from Israel. Next up is Italy, who is declining, correct? Yes. All right, so at their height, Italy was up at about, gonna have to shrink down to 28 for this. At their height, Italy was up at about 8 billion cubic feet per day of demand, and that was in the mid 2000s. Since then, they have fallen down to about 5.5 in terms of their consumption. And for production, they were once up at 3 or 4 billion cubic feet per day, but that was decades ago. Their stuff is mostly depleted now, and they're down to, I think, I might be off on this one. I did not write theirs down, so forgive me if I'm off. They're down to about 700 million with an M cubic feet per day, or 0.7 billion cubic feet per day of production. So they are predominantly reliant on imports. And then after them, we have the Central Asian countries. Uzbekistan is at a demand level of 5, and they have increased from 4.5 up to 5 over the last 10 years or so. They are at 5 billion cubic feet per day of domestic consumption and about 6 billion cubic feet per day of domestic production. So they are self-sufficient in that. Turkey has also grown from 4.5 10 years ago up to a domestic consumption level of about 5 billion cubic feet per day now. And their natural gas production as of the moment is very negligible. I think they're over 100 million cubic feet per day. They might be close to 200, but it's effectively might as well be zero. And Algeria over the last 10 years has grown from 3.5 up to now averaging about 5 billion cubic feet per day of consumption. And they were averaging between 10 and 11 up until this year. They have finally activated the capacity expansions at their already active fields and just hit a new record high of 13.2 a few days ago. So on average, they're probably going to wobble more around 12. So for safety, we'll put them at 12 instead of 13 just yet. So the same production level as Norway. So they are a exporter by 7 to 8 billion cubic feet per day. And then who's next on the consumption level? Yeah, it only goes down pretty quickly from here. Like the next largest consumer is Thailand, who is at only 4.5. We're down to size 26. Yeah, they're at 4.5, and they've been pretty steady for the last 10 years in their consumption levels. This is actually a bit lower than they were 10 years ago, but not by that much. And their domestic production levels, their output from their fields, is around 3 billion cubic feet per day in present day. Since I mentioned Norway as a decent producer, we'll throw them in here, even though they don't even really make the list, the consumption list, that is. Norway produces or outputs about 12.5 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas over a domestic consumption level of only about 400 million with an M cubic feet per day of gas. So Norway has one of the largest natural gas export ratios. And then, just like the UAE, I cannot fit Qatar in there. So we're just going to put a Q out here in the ocean. Put a Q. Qatar has reached a domestic consumption level of 4.5. They've been climbing slowly up from 3.5 10 years ago. So they're at 4.5 billion cubic feet per day of domestic consumption versus an average of about 21 billion cubic feet per day of domestic production. That is going to jump up to 24 theoretically in the first half of next year, because the first expansion of 3 at the Pars gas field is theoretically going to be finished later this year, but we'll see. And then the next one will be finished in either late 2027 or early 2028. That will take them up to 27. And then in early 2030 or late 2029, the third expansion will occur, which will take them up to a natural gas output level of 30 billion cubic feet per day. But we'll see how much on schedule things remain. And I'll only keep going with the ones that are above 4. I won't keep going for everybody below that for the sake of moving this along, because I assumed I was only going to be doing this for about an hour, but it's been decently longer than that. So for Indonesia, they have remained pretty stable in their natural gas consumption levels, about 4.5 billion cubic feet per day. Let me move this over here. Versus a production level of currently about 6 billion cubic feet per day. That will be going up to about 7 over the course of this year as they activate some new natural gas fields. And then their neighbor, with a much smaller population, but economically much more farther along, at the moment at least. Although it's not like economic development isn't evenly distributed amongst the population. Like, it's not like all 283 million people in Indonesia live at the same like low economic level. It's more like about 60 million people, primarily around like Jakarta and other more prominent cities, live at like a pretty decent level, like similar to Brazil. And then the other 200 million people are still living like pretty low. Malaysia is at 4 point, keep forgetting to change the text color. Malaysia is also at 4.5 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas consumption versus reaching about 8 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas production now as they continue activating new offshore fields. And as I said, most of what they still have offshore is predominantly natural gas. Uh, Australia is okay. I'm pretty sure that's Australia, but I forgot to label them on the notepad that I'm reading. I wrote down all the data on. I forgot to actually label them. So Australia is at about 4 billion cubic feet per day of domestic consumption versus domestic production or output from their fields of about 16 billion cubic feet per day. And then the one other country that is 4 or over is currently Argentina, who has reached a domestic consumption level of 4.5 billion cubic feet per day, which they are now providing themselves. They have now become self-sufficient in, just like how they became a net oil exporter again, with their oil production finally exceeding their domestic consumption once again last year. Last year also, back in 2023, their natural gas production levels once again actually exceeded their consumption levels, as their natural gas production or output levels are now at about 5.3 billion cubic feet per day. And that's everyone we're going to cover in terms of natural gas, because I got to make sure we move on through additional stuff. All right, got them out of the way. All right. I'm not going to type everything out on the map this time. I'm just going to highlight the particular country in question at the given moment. So I will list out the global breakdown at least. So for breakdown of oil demand, oil consumption by individual product, by each individual component, for the components that like we get data for at least, because not everybody releases the same data about the same stuff, but everybody is will do WT for world total. World total is currently a bit above 104 million barrels per day. And for the individual products within that, the largest demand source is diesel, which is about 28 million barrels per day of diesel fuel are consumed worldwide. Gasoline has reached 25 million barrels per day. Uh, Plastic, and plastic is a huge umbrella. Most people just immediately think of the plastic that is at the front of your mind is like plastic bottles, bags, and wrappers, and that is part of it. But remember, a lot of other things are there too, like nylon and polyester. So a lot of clothing, carpets. That's what that's made out of. Glue and adhesive, or no, sorry, glue and adhesives are petrochemicals, not plastics. Cushion foam, not people immediately just think of memory foam, but just generic cushion foam and mattress foam is also technically plastic. Basically, the division comes down to plastic is essentially a oil derived chemical component that is naturally solid. For the most part, that's how it breaks down. Whereas petrochemicals are components, oil derived chemical components that are typically liquid. Now, they might be in the form of a solid when combined with other things. Like if you use a bar of soap instead of liquid soap from a bottle, if you use a solid bar of soap, the different petrochemical components in there, they're in a solid bar because they're combined with things like coconut resin or paraffin wax and stuff. But those individual petrochemicals would be liquid if they were not in that solid bar of soap. So that's usually how the distinction goes. So petrochemicals includes soaps, shampoos, all kinds of cleaning chemicals, a lot of intermediary chemicals that you don't use yourself or ever see in your life, but are used in factories as like catalysts and intermediary middleman chemicals in the process of making other chemicals or other end products. Whereas plastics are all the solid petrochemical products like polyethylene, which is what plastic bottles and trash bags are made out of. Polypropylene is what harder plastic stuff is made out of, like Legos, computer cases, and the like. Polystyrene or styrofoam. Insulation for houses and buildings is also counts as a plastic because it's a solid petrochemical. So that's my quick rant, so that you'll know the distinction. Plastics, total plastic end product consumption comprises just over 14 million barrels per day. Jet fuel, JT for jet, jet fuel is back up to comprising 8 million barrels per day. out of the global oil consumption total, finally recovered from the COVID crash. Who's up next? It is petrochemicals. Petrochemicals is up to about 6.7 million barrels per day. Marine fuel, or fuel used by ships, by cargo vessels, container ships, oil tankers, natural gas vessels, even passenger ferries. Fuel, typically in the form of a heavy fuel oil used by ships at sea. Marine fuel uh, is around roughly 6.3 million barrels per day. And then everything else falling under other is roughly between 12 and 13 or so. Again, roughly, or roughing out the numbers. And the other category comprises basically everything that doesn't fit anywhere else. Power plant fuel oil, used for power generation, like in Saudi Arabia, who still uses about 500,000 barrels per day of oil burning just to generate its power. Total global fuel oil consumption is not adequately tracked, but I believe it's down close to only being 1 million barrels per day now. Again, half of that fuel oil for electricity generation that's still being used is half of that is just Saudi Arabia doing that. So that's part of the other, along with everything from rubber for tires, which is I think around 500,000 barrels per day of oil is used to make rubber, or like 400,000. I know 100,000 barrels per day is used to make hydraulic fluid, which comprises brake fluids, actuator fluid, hydraulic fluid for when it's actually called hydraulic fluid, which is usually in construction vehicles. It gets named different things in different vehicles and different factory components for some reason, but it's all hydraulic fluid, grease, and machine lubricant fluid, along with LPGs, or liquid petroleum gases, like the like cooking stove gases and stuff, for stoves that are not connected to an actual natural gas provision line, along with tar and asphalt. About 2 to 3 million barrels per day of that gets used for roads and for roofing buildings. Anyways, so that is the total breakdown for the global composition of that. So I'm going to need you to bear with me here. I was not going to type everything out for each country because I'm going to try to go through it more quickly. So the U.S. has still a average demand level of about 20 million barrels per day, staying pretty consistent since the mid 2000s, as the adoption of fuel efficiency in the U.S. has been more gradual rather than brute forced like in Europe. So it decreased U.S. fuel use at just enough of a pace to not let our increasing population take our demand levels up over the same time. The two have balanced each other out. So we've stayed at about 20 million barrels per day. Out of that 20 million barrels per day, about 9 million barrels per day is gasoline consumption. A little under 4 million barrels per day is diesel consumption, around 3.8 on average. Jet fuel used to be 2 million. It is now 1.7. It's climbing back up towards 2. During the COVID year, it fell down to 1. U.S. marine fuel consumption is usually between 300 and 400,000. Petrochemical consumption is around or a bit above 2 million, likely around 2.2. And U.S. petrochemical production is unfortunately something we have to work on because only 200 or 300,000 barrels per day is actually produced in the U.S. Doesn't need to be an actual match, like actual numbers match, like Trump keeps crying about, but a lesser imbalance would be more preferable. Plastic consumption, plastic products is about 3 million barrels per day, and other is everything else, obviously. China is high enough to where I'll still color them in black. China grew from 11 million barrels per day in the uh, mid 2010s up to about 17 million now, and they're leveling off here, and they're probably going to be tipping over an edge soon, especially in the economic backlash from when they attempt their Taiwan invasion soon enough. Out of that 17 million or so, roughly 3.5 million barrels per day of that is gasoline. Close to 4 is diesel, 3.8 or 3.7. Their jet fuel is climbing back up towards 1 million. They got pretty close before COVID, but then fell down like everybody else. Their jet fuel is now back up to about 900,000. Marine fuel is close to 800,000 barrels per day. Their petrochemicals consumption is about 2. It's actually about the same as the US, about 2 or 2.1, 2.2. Their total plastic consumption is close to 3, or about the same as the US, actually, around 2.8. And then the rest all just falls under the generic other category. India is all alone in its group between 5 and 6. Over the last 10 years, they have increased by 50% their oil demand levels from 4 million barrels per day up to 6, out of which out of that 6,760,000 barrels per day is gasoline. Close to 2 million is diesel. About 1.87 was the average for last year. And just a few weeks ago, back in April, I think, they actually went over 2 million barrels per day of diesel consumption for the first time. Their jet fuel demand is actually lower than it was 10 years ago, and is kind of stalled out around 200,000 barrels per day. Their marine fuel consumption is not really climbing all that fast. They've only gone from about 100 up to about 120 over the last 10 years. Uh, their their plastic consumption has gone up pretty fast and is up to about 1.5 million. Their petrochemical consumption is actually really low, around the 250, maybe 300,000 barrel per day range. And everything else is in other, although they might be classifying some stuff differently. So they might, uh, that number is really imbalanced. So I think they might be throwing some petrochemical stuff into the plastic category or throwing some stuff into the other category. But I can't like get any further into that unless they like just straight up gave me like government access to their data, which no one's going to do. Europe as a whole, excluding Turkey, Belarus, and Russia, Europe as a whole has to Europe's to Europe's non-desire, most likely, still increased in oil demand in total from 13.3 up to 14 million barrels per day over the last 10 years, primarily from rising demand levels in the Eastern European nations, as many of them have finally gone through the later process of economically rising pretty quickly. But uh, out of that 14 million barrels per day in Europe, only about 2.1 million barrels per day is gasoline consumption. 5.6 million barrels per day is diesel consumption. Jet fuel comprises about 1.4. Marine fuel comprises about 800,000. Petrochemicals comprise about 700,000, and plastics comprise about 1.2 million. And then everything else is stuff that falls under the other category. So asphalt, tar, rubber, hydraulic fluid, mechanical grease and lubricant stuff. All right, then we have Japan, who will be bright red, as they're decently larger than a lot of others, but they're still under 5. They've declined, as I say often in the monthly demand level update videos, from 6 at their peak in the 90s all the way down to only about 3.5. Out of their 3.5 million barrels per day, uh, roughly 739,000 last year was gasoline. They've declined over the last 10 years, down from 915. They've declined over the last 10 years in diesel consumption from 808 down to a flat 700,000. In jet fuel from 522 down to 430,000. Marine fuel staying pretty consistent between 250 and 300,000. Between 250 and 300,000. And they did have a spike upwards to like 100 or 200,000 barrels per day of fuel oil consumption. Again, for those first few years in the early 2010s post Fukushima, but that has died out now. Petrochemical consumption around 472,000 barrels per day, declined from 639, and plastic consumption 502 down over the last decade to 381, as they're doing similar stuff to Europe, trying to phase at least portions of it out. And then everything else obviously falls under other. Russia, out of animosity and vindictiveness towards me specifically, obviously, has stopped publishing a lot of like data of every kind. So, you know, going out of their way to make things difficult for me to get a hold of. They And so in things like the Statistical Review of World Energy, you'll start to see their post 2022 data will typically have like little asterisks next to the numbers, which, usually means like see below or something. And, they'll have connotations next to them saying, basically saying this is a vague estimate. They stopped officially publishing numbers, so we're just assuming things. So before they stopped publishing official numbers, their gasoline consumption was usually roughly around 800,000 and it was plateauing out. Their diesel consumption was usually around 800,000 also, and it was plateauing out. Uh, math wise, from the decrease in air traffic within and to and from Russia, their jet fuel demand has dropped from 250 down to 200,000. And their marine fuel consumption has dropped from 200,000 down to only around 80,000, as they are no longer shipping out as much stuff, obviously. And their other stuff, unclear. Brazil is usually around 2.5 now. Most recently, last year, they averaged 2.6, and out of that, about 555,000 was gasoline, which is their gasoline has stayed about the same. So as their diesel, at just over a million, 1.04 million barrels per day. Their jet fuel has also stayed about the same at 120,000. Their marine fuel is close to 100. It's around 89, and it is climbing as their output levels of critical minerals and oil continues to go up, so they're shipping more and more stuff outwards. Uh, their their petrochemical demand is at about 132,000 barrels per day. Their plastic consumption is at about 340, and everything else falling under other is about 301. And outside of oil and its related petrochemical products, they do also consume about 600 or 700,000 barrels per day of ethanol fuel made from sugarcane, which has a net energy yield ratio of between 6 and 10 to 1, versus corn-derived ethanol up in the U.S., which is a negligent, irresponsible one-to-one trade. Saudi Arabia could be below 2 if they were not still generating power from oil-fired power plants, but they're averaging around 2.5 or a bit below it, out of which their gasoline consumption has stayed relatively the same for the past 10 years at about 520,000. Their diesel fuel consumption has actually gone down, which is usually a indicator that an economy is starting to degrade a bit. You know, the actual economy, not the oil and gas, completely oil and gas reliant revenue economy, but, you know, other stuff, businesses and industry. If diesel fuel starts going down pretty quickly, that's usually a bad indicator you don't want to see. Their diesel fuel consumption over the last 10 years has dropped from 753 down to 540. Their jet fuels remained kind of the same. It's climbed a little bit, coming in at 75,000 barrels per day last year. Their marine fuel is at around 100,000 barrels per day. Their fuel oil has decreased from 700,000 down to around 450 or 460, as they have switched a lot of power generation over to natural gas, but they are still they're still generating a lot of power from it. And their plastics consumption is around 400,000, and that's the edge of the data. For Africa as a whole, the entire continent over the last 10 years has climbed from 4 up to just 4.6 million barrels per day. And out of that 4.6, gasoline comprises 1.34, which is up a bit from 1.1 a decade ago. Diesel fuel constitutes about 1.9 or 1.86, up from a flat 1.6 a decade ago. Jet fuel is relatively the same, coming in this time at 273. Their marine fuel consumption has actually decreased from 420 down to 311, as a lot of economies, like this one, you know, down here, have been running into issues. And also this one, Nigeria, has, you know, seen their oil production drop substantially and thus is not shipping a lot of oil tankers out. So less and less ships burning marine fuel. Uh, their plastics consumption for the whole continent, all 1.1 billion people, is around 570,000, and not too specific for everything else. Let me check who else we got here, or who else I'm going to go through at least. Indonesia just qualifying as red, as they are now in present day averaging over 2 million barrels per day of oil demand or oil consumption. Out of their 2.1 average, about 700,000 barrels per day is gasoline, which is up from 500,000 a decade ago. About 600,000 is diesel, which is up from not too much, up from 557 a decade ago. Their jet fuel is relatively the same at about 61 this time. Their marine fuel has climbed from 50 up to 90, and their plastics consumption has relatively doubled. Petrochemical consumption likely has followed suit, but couldn't get specific, and other has been increasing as well as they continue with like further modernization and road paving and infrastructure products and stuff. Germany, Deutschland is usually around 2.1 million today as well. You're back over on this side. And they have declined from 2.4 10 years ago down to 2.1 now. And out of that 2.1, about just under 500,000 is gasoline, which is down from 701,000 back in the 90s at their peak. Back 10 years ago, not in the 90s, just 10 years ago, their Diesel fuel consumption was 1.1 million. Now it's only about 900,000. Their jet fuel is about the same, around 200,000 barrels per day. Their marine fuel has dropped from 50 down to only 37,000. Their plastics and petrochemicals have stayed relatively the same at about 100,000. And their other is between 200 and 300, or no, sorry, it might be over 300. Canada is, sorry, not doing all the islands this time. Canada is usually around 2.5, and out of their 2.5, presently about 761,000 is gasoline. That's down from 879 10 years ago. About 552,000 is diesel. That's down from 600 10 years ago. Their jet fuel has remained relatively the same at about 150. Their marine fuel is at 300,000 barrels per day, and their plastics and petrochemicals are around 200,000 barrels per day, and then everything else falls under other. Then down south, Mexico used to be at 2 million barrels per day, but now they're only averaging about 1.6. They were not decreasing naturally. They just dropped with COVID, but never actually recovered back to their normal levels. Out of their 1.6 currently, about 744,000 barrels per day is gasoline, down from 800,000 10 years ago. Diesel fuel is down to only 263, down from 434 10 years ago. Jet fuel is about the same, 92,000 most recently. Marine fuel is down to only between 75 and 90 or so, down from 150 10 years ago, back when they were still exporting a bigger amount of stuff. Their plastics consumption's around 175, petrochemicals 72, and everything else falls into other. France is at 1.6 as well, down a little bit from 1.7 10 years ago. And out of their 1.6, you have 264,000 barrels per day as gasoline, which is actually up from 200,000 10 years ago. Diesel fuel took the biggest drop from 1 million barrels per day 10 years ago down to 762,000 now. Their jet fuel is actually a bit higher than 10 years ago, 150 versus now 182. Their marine fuel was about 50 10 years ago. Now it's more like in the 30s. Their plastics consumption has declined from 130 down to 106 as they're trying to do less plastic, like most of Europe. And then everything else is everything else. Does anybody? Oh, whoop, forgot. I forgot there was another side of the paper. Turkey is at about 1.2 in present day, and that is up from 750,000 10 years ago. And out of that 1.2, you have 111,000 barrels per day is gasoline, up from 45,000 10 years ago. Diesel fuel about 537, up from 363 10 years ago. Jet fuel consumption 127, up from only 76 10 years ago. Marine fuel supposedly only 30,000, but fuel's kind of off, so I think they might be under classifying some stuff. Plastics consumption about 73,000, and petrochemical consumption likely between half to as much as the same as that. And then everything else is obviously other. Singapore is too small to color in, but they peaked at 1.4 not 10 years ago, I think 8 years ago, and they've declined down to 1.2 since then. Out of that 1.2 currently, only about 20,000 barrels per day out of 1.2 million is gasoline. Diesel is about 109. Jet fuel is about 155. Marine fuel is in the 800s. It's declined from closer to 900 down to mid or lower 800s now over the last 10 years as they uh, Singapore is kind of like the world uh, maritime shipping hub. Australia is back up to where they were pre-COVID at about 1.15 million, out of which 272,000 is gasoline, which is down from 320 10 years ago. Diesel fuel is up to 566, which is up from 430 10 years ago. Jet fuel is about the same at around 160. Marine fuel is Marine fuel is between 60 and 70,000. I was able to split their stuff up because they were only reporting uh, heavy fuel oil as marine fuel and not the lighter fuel oils and then the high speed marine diesel. So I had to conglomerate those together. And then, yeah, everything else after that. Let's see, who else can we throw in here? Throw in Vietnam, who has now hit 700,000 and exceeded it. They're at 707, up from 379 10 years ago. And out of that 707, you have 180,000 or so barrels per day being gasoline, which is up from 105 10 years ago, almost double. Diesel fuel from 135 10 years ago up to now in the lower 200s, around like 210 or 220. Jet fuel up from only 19 10 years ago up to around 50 now, or 45. Marine fuel for large shipping vessels, only around 15 at the moment, but that's going to be going up pretty quickly. There are a lot of ships going out, like from Vietnam. Like if you look at a shipping tracker, but a lot of those are small individual fishing boats, which are only using maritime gasoline, of which they don't really use all that much. Plastic consumption around 50,000, and everything else falls under other. Iran, before the war started, was averaging around 1.8 million barrels per day or so, out of which 476,000 was gasoline, 673,000 was diesel, only 22,000 was jet fuel, about 50,000 was marine fuel, about 100,000 was fuel oil, and then everything else kind of just falls into the same heap. Iraq, right next to them, is at about 900,000 barrels per day now, up from 700 10 years ago, out of which about 170 or 180 is gasoline, which is up from 110 a decade ago. Diesel fuel is at only about 170 or 180, which is actually decently down from 339 a decade ago. Jet fuel only 3,000 barrels per day. Not a lot of people are willingly going to Iraq. Marine fuel is up from 20 to 80,000 barrels per day. Fuel oil is up from 150 to 180,000 barrels per day. And everything in the other category is up from 210 to now about 360. Polska is up to 800,000, up from 500 10 years ago. Out of that 800, gasoline comprises 134, which is up from 83 10 years ago. Diesel fuel is almost up to 400, coming up from 250 10 years ago. Jet fuel has climbed from around 10 up to now around 30. And marine fuel is steadily the same, only around 20,000. See, that is That is not the same page. Okay, that is actually a different page. Algeria has just hit 500,000 barrels per day, up from 416 10 years ago, out of which about 80,000 barrels per day is gasoline, about 205 is diesel, about 10,000 is jet fuel, and don't have much else clearly specified. Venezuela has crashed pretty hard. Just around the middle of the decade, they hit 780,000 barrels per day of oil consumption. Then through the later 2010s, they collapsed down to a low point of 168,000 of domestic consumption. They've recovered over the last few years up to 250, out of which you have 92,000 being gasoline, which is down from 266 at their consumption peak. 63,000 being diesel, which is down from 237 during their consumption peak. Under 6,000 barrels per day being jet fuel, down from 14,000 at their peak. About 10,000 barrels per day being fuel oil, which is down from 30,000 at their peak. Marine fuel only coming in at about 10,000, as since when they collapsed, they took their oil production down with them. So they're not exporting remotely near as much oil because they're only pumping about 1 million barrels per day instead of 3 million plus. Uh, whereas previously they consumed about 40,000 barrels per day of marine fuel 10 years ago at their peak. Plastic consumption, only about 10,000 barrels per day, and other is everything else. Swing over to Nigeria, who is at about 650,000, which is up from 450,000 in consumption 10 years ago. And out of that 650, the overwhelming majority is gasoline at close to 370 or 380, which is up from 300 10 years ago. Diesel fuel is around 90, which is up from 60 10 years ago. Jet fuel is up to 14, climbing up from 8 10 years ago. Marine fuel has fallen down to 12, as there's not a lot of stuff coming into and out of Nigeria. A lot of that is primarily oil tankers, and there's less of them now since their oil production has fallen down by quite a bit, so they're not exporting as much. And their plastics and petrochemical consumptions are both around like 10. Let's see, is there anybody else interesting on here? Or was there uh, anybody saying anything interesting? Uh, that's some kind of trolling, or it might be a reference I don't get. Don't screw around too much. I just ban people. Usually I operate on a zero strike or one strike policy, but I'm feeling lazy today. Argentina is pretty much the same. They're at around 700,000 barrels per day, out of which 152,000 is gasoline, 291,000 is diesel. That's higher than 232 10 years ago. Jet fuel is down to 25,000 from 33 10 years ago. Fuel oil is down to 40,000 from 80,000 10 years ago. They used to generate uh, a more sizable portion of their electricity from fuel oil, and indeterminate specifics from the other stuff. Oops, have to switch back over to orange. The UK, over the last 10 years, has declined from 1.6 down to 1.5 million barrels per day of consumption, out of which 299,000 barrels per day is gasoline, which is close to half of what they consumed at their peak back in the 90s at their highest levels of demand. Diesel fuel has only gone down a bit from 612 10 years ago down to 573 now. Jet fuel is about the same at around a quarter million or so. Marine fuel is around 60 or 70, which is about the same. And their plastics consumption equivalent has gone down from 90,000 to around 60,000 barrels per day. Petrochemicals is roughly between 30 and 40, and then everything else obviously falls under other. Italy is around 1.3 million barrels per day, and out of that, 194,000 is gasoline, which is about the same as 10 years ago. 547,000 is diesel, which is about the same as 10 years ago. Jet fuel is 107,000, which is actually higher than 10 years ago when it was only 81. Marine fuel has declined from 70 down to more around 60,000 barrels per day. Plastics consumption and petrochemical consumption should both be around 50 or 60. And then everything else falls under other, which is around between 200 and 250,000 barrels per day, usually. Spain is also at 1.3, which is actually up from 1.2 10 years ago, because that was the mid or early 2010s when they had their economic crash along with Greece. They're at 1.3, out of which 151,000 is gasoline, up from 107 10 years ago. 608,000 is diesel, which is close to the same as 10 years ago. Jet fuel is up to 151,000 barrels per day, which is higher than the 114 it was at 10 years ago. Marine fuel had dropped down to 100,000 10 years ago. Now it's back up to 150. Plastics was at 83 and it has dropped down to under 70. Fuel oil for oil-fired power generation, because Spain used to do that, has declined from 60,000 down to 30,000 barrels per day. And the one other one on this page is Egypt, who has remained relatively the same in the mid 800s for the last 10 years. Out of their 800 or 850,000 barrels per day, 166,000 is gasoline, which is about the same as 10 years ago. 300,000 is diesel, which is a little bit higher than the 280 of 10 years ago. Their jet fuel demand has decreased as travel to Egypt is lower than it was 10 years ago, from 29 down to 19,000. Marine fuel is about the same, about 100,000 barrels per day. Fuel oil consumption has dropped from 100,000 barrels per day down to only about 50, as they've switched more electricity generation over to gas-fired power plants, which they're now having a supply issue with, as they're not properly maintaining the oil and gas production infrastructure. All right, what about on this side of the paper? Colombia has also, just like Algeria, reached 500,000 barrels per day, up from 340 10 years ago, out of which gasoline comprises 154,000, up from 99 10 years ago. Diesel fuel is about the same at 140 or 150. Jet fuel is up from 22 up to 35, as travel and vacations to Colombia are actually increasing. Marine fuel is only about 23,000. Plastics is around 20,000 barrels per day equivalent. Petrochemicals unknown. Bangladesh has increased over the last 10 years by 150% in oil demand from 111 up to 264. However, they hit the 260s a year or two ago, and since then have leveled off as their economy has started buckling and doing a speed run of South Africa, basically. But out of that 264, only about 17,000 barrels per day is gasoline. About 100,000 barrels per day is diesel. 11,000 barrels per day is jet fuel. 70,000 barrels per day is fuel oil, as they have started relying on fuel oil fired power plants to fill the gaps of their other power plants, their coal and gas plants, which are breaking down. because just like South Africa, they have not been properly maintained because there's been a lot of government embezzling of money going on behind the scenes. Uh, let's see. I think I'm missing a page. I was pretty sure there was a fourth page of countries. I do not know where I put the fourth page. It seems to be missing. Give me 1 second. That's natural gas. That is electricity. That's coal. Already did all that. All right, I can't find the fourth page, so we're just going to do nuclear power real quick. And then that's going to be it because I needed to stop because I've been going way longer than I was supposed to. And, just for the fun of it, we'll throw it on Google Earth for the end. I'll give Google, their deserved opportunity to ruin the stream. Wait for them to load. Load. You're gonna mess things up? You're gonna mess things up? No, you're not messing things up. Excellent. All right, so in total, nuclear power has begun expanding again as certain countries in the world, at least, not all, have started getting intelligent about electricity generation and not pursuing flightless dreams anymore. So nuclear power generation over the last 10 years has climbed from a global total average of 290 gigawatts at any moment up to 322, out of which the US is the largest nuclear power generator. About 20% of our power comes from nuclear, usually fluctuating between 90 and 100 gigawatts at any given moment. Here, I'll actually show you on the electricity thing, the live grid tracker. This is why nuclear power is the best here. It should get thinner if we shut off natural gas. There we go. So you see that straight purple line there running across the thing? That is nuclear. Constant, ever reliable. Currently generating 92.5 gigawatts of output. So the US has remained relatively the same in total nuclear output. However, that's finally about to change as a number of reactors that were shut down previously due to economic reasons are now going to be reactivated. There's one in Michigan. There's one in, I think, either Minnesota or Wisconsin, or no, it might be Illinois, and one other in Pennsylvania. And supposedly, they might, if they're smart about it, reactivate the Pilgrim Station nuclear plants back up where I lived a long time ago on Cape Cod, where I grew up as a child. My grandma actually worked at that nuclear plant, so I got to visit it once when I was a little kid. But three are in discussion to be reactivated, uh, which I think in total the three of them are like 2.5 gigawatts of capacity that would be coming back. China, over the last 10 years, from 2014 until now, has gone from 15 gigawatts of nuclear, constantly generated nuclear power, up to nuclear providing 51 gigawatts of constant, consistent electricity to the grid. The third largest nuclear generator is France, who is at about 43. Unfortunately, that is less than the 50 that they were generating 10 years ago, as they are not stupid enough like Germany to just shut all their nuclear down like an idiot, but they are dumb enough to where nuclear power is the that's the one they're choosing to shut down as their domestic electricity average demand decreases over time. Then the fourth place goes to Russia, who is roughly the same. They're in the low 20s, and they've been in the low 20s for like 10 or 15 years. Last year, they averaged around 23 gigawatts from nuclear. South Korea has increased their nuclear power generation from 18 gigawatts on average 10 years ago up to 21 and a half now. Their neighbor Japan was at about 34 gigawatts of nuclear power generation, electricity wise, pre Fukushima. And afterwards, as they have begun reactivating their nuclear reactors over the last 3 years, they have now returned to over 10 gigawatts of nuclear power online. Back over here to the north of the US, Canada has unfortunately decreased theirs a bit, trading it out for wind and somehow solar, because Canada is not that bright and can't do the whole high northern latitude solar power inefficiency math. They've decreased their nuclear power from 12 to only 10 gigawatts. Then we go over to Europe once more, where we have Spain generating a relatively constant 6 gigawatts for the last 10 years. Ukraine was generating about 10 gigawatts of nuclear power. Now it's only doing 6, as that's one plant that's in Russian occupied territory had to be dialed down for obvious reasons. India has gradually been adding some, although small in numbers. In percentage, it was a big leap by 50%. They went up from 4 to 6 gigawatts of nuclear power. Sweden, Sverige, is also being done. They've dropped themselves from 7.5 down to only 5.8 gigawatts of nuclear power. The UAE, being smart, has gone from 0 up to about 5 gigawatts of nuclear power. And this year should be capping out at the 5.6 that their Baraka or Bakara nuclear plant maxes out at. Let's see, who else is at what level? The UK making one intelligent decision. So they did shut down a really old one, dropping from 7.3 down to 6 gigawatts of nuclear power. However, they are actually constructing new nuclear reactors. So in theory, around 2030 or so, maybe 2032, they will be going back up by a few gigawatts at least. Germany, the dumbest of them all, went from 9 gigawatts of nuclear power down to 0. Who else do we have here? Finland, Sumi, being very intelligent, went from 2.7 up to 3.7 gigawatts of nuclear power, increasing their percentage and thus reducing, the amount of gas and or coal they have to burn. The thing that Europe supposedly hates the most, but keeps making decisions that make them have to burn more of it. The Czech Republic, solid and steady, 3.5 gigawatts, consistent. Belgium, solid and steady for the moment at least. You guys might get dumb, at a moment's notice. I don't know. 3.5 gigawatts. Brazil, solid and steady, 1.8. Although they are building a new reactor that should take them up to either 2.5 or 3 in like 5 years or so, I think. Argentina started up a new reactor a couple of years ago, taking them from half a gigawatt up to 1 solid. Mexico, where's Mexico? Mexico staying solid at 1.4. Switzerland, or Switzerland, I'm not sure, staying steady at 2.5 gigawatts. South Africa, one of the only two countries that has like a legitimate excuse to be shutting off their nuclear plants. They've dropped from 1.6 down to 0.8 because what few competent individuals they still have in some of their government departments have kind of watched the dilapidation and degradation of their entire national infrastructure and realized that they should probably, as a precaution, shut theirs down, you know, just in case the level of like corruption and energy funding embezzlement gets really dumb. Pakistan has gone from half a gigawatt 10 years ago up to 2.5 now. Taiwan was generating 5. They're now down to 1, and they are going to 0. They're the one other country that has an excuse to be shutting it down because, the whole mega invasion is coming soon. So, out of precaution, they've been quietly shutting their reactors down because they don't want the risk of them getting targeted and struck or even just accidentally getting hit. And wait, is that the end of the list? I thought there were a few more people on it. There are a few others who have some reactors, just not that much. Uh, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, as far as I know, they do have some. It's just not a lot, but their electricity demand levels are really low, anyways. Turkey is going to be building at least one nuclear power plant. Poland, Polska, is going full in on it and is going to start in the next couple of years construction, or actually, sorry, no, the initial construction already started, but the actual, like, completely committed portion will be starting in, I think, 2028. And in the early 2030s, sometime is when things will be completed. They're building a large 6 gigawatts nuclear power station comprised of 4 reactors that will add up to a total of 6 gigawatts. Egypt wants to do at least one nuclear plant. And I think Jordan actually said they were potentially going to look at an SMR one, a small modular one, but we'll see. And Kazakhstan is going to be doing at least one that will be a 1.5 gigawatt plant. Oh, and yeah, I forgot. Australia. Australia finally actually accepted the reality that, the whole all wind and solar everything isn't really a viable option. Uh, and so they have at least now considered looking into maybe doing some nuclear power. But we'll have to wait and see. That is going to be it for this one. For the CO2 levels update data, I already did a shorter video on that you can find on the channel, along with one of the other updates. I think like the breakdown of how each country generates its electricity. At least I think that's the one I did already. Yeah, CO2 emissions by country and how each country generates electricity in 2025. Okay, so I already did those two data sets because that data was actually released before the entire statistical review came out a few days ago. So this is all the stuff I was covering in this one because this stuff did not come out until the actual full data sheet was released. But that's going to be it for this one because this has been 2.5 hours of me talking, which I did not plan on, and most of you probably did not plan on either. So this is going to be where I cut it off.